It is a new year for lemons, and that means time for some New Year's resolutions. Me, this year, I'm gonna start eating better, gonna finally learn how to play gypsy jazz on the guitar, and I'm gonna get involved with some exciting new ways to think about archaeology.
Scientists were able to mimic Nessie Amun's voice by recreating his mouth and vocal cords with a 3D printer. It allowed them to produce a single sound.
Yeah, I like the music idea. I'm going to become a hip-hop DJ.
But, of course, what a fresh calendar means is we have almost 24 more Lemons races full of crappy cars, broken parts, and great people. And as we have done for the last 10 years, we start the new year at the finely manicured grounds of Barber Motorsports Park, so let's get into it.
All right, at Barber, let's start with some absolutely spectacular rookie teams. First, we have 100 horsepower hooligans in their Jeep Comanche. This had the Archer Brothers Racing livery, of course. It's a Jeep 4.0 with a stock automatic and the ratchet shifter for a GM Turbo 400. I don't think that's the transmission that's in there. Maybe it is. I don't know. Plus giant off-road tires. Basically, they raced it exactly how they found it, which was amazing.
Related, although not quite rookies, was Reformation Racing and their Jeep Grand Cherokee, which also had the 4-liter and an automatic and kind of a weird truck body conversion. They were in the IOE race until they blew up with about 4 hours to go. They still beat like 60 teams.
And then you had Sheopol Racing. Sheepo Racing? I don't know.
Opal.
Sheopol. They got an Opel GT, and when you show up as first-timers at a Lemons race with an Opel GT, you're already way ahead of the curve. They didn't just show up. They showed up with an Opel GT that had a Thunderbird turbo coupe engine, Ford Ranger transmission, Jeep Wrangler radiator, Mazda RX-7 rear axle, Toyota 4Runner brake calipers, and brake rotors from, I think, a Honda. There were some issues with this combination. They may or may not have done 2 laps total, but this is how you make a good first impression on the Lemons staff.
Enduro Works were kind of the right attitude, if less interesting car kind of rookies, and they needed a bit of help, but you gotta ask, why was the Cookie Monster fur patchy on their E46? Well, they bought a 9 by 12 foot shag carpet on Marketplace and cut it up to roughly kind of fit a little. What they failed to tell the judges before we touched it with our bare hands was where it had come from, so I'm actually on my way out of here to go get a new round of vaccinations.
Now, this race was just before baseball spring training, so the judges wore their best in baseball attire. We had Judge Kristen as a Rockford Peach, Judge Craig in Bad News Bears regalia, and Judge Eric and the newly minted Judge Chris as old-timey managers.
Now, correspondingly, we had some spring training penalties, which included a scouting workout where I made the team go make a baseball glove out of whatever was in their paddock. Now, one of the teams had their kid's t-ball glove, which was not that exciting, but we did have a team make a glove out of Gorilla Tape and a cut-up windshield wiper fluid bottle. That kid's going places.
Elsewhere in the penalty box, the number 272 Crown Vic gave us a giant bucket of change and coin sleeves, which facilitated the Coinstar Unplugged penalty.
This being a race in the South, there were plenty of Ford Thunderbirds. We will start with Thin Blue Swine, whose car was turned into a Johnny Lightning die-cast. Now, Johnny Lightning did an alternate version of all the castings, including a blue one, and Silent But Deadly painted their Thunderbird like the alternate version, and here they both were in the same place at the same time.
And because this is Alabama, we had a third separate Bill Elliott-themed Fox Thunderbird, this one from Fools Racing.
Now, Barely Legal has had this wide-body Thunderbird for years. This was its final race. They are building something new and awesome. The car was parked most this weekend, which allowed the team to understand the joys of racing a slow car, their Subaru Forester.
Yet another Ford Thunderbird was brought by Pocket Dogs. Now, this is the team of actual carnies. It's not just a carny theme. And instead of the corn dogs in their pockets that they brought at their first race, they brought a lemonade stand that they towed behind their car through BS inspection. That was hella sweet.
In addition to many Thunderbirds, we also had several multi-car teams. Our defending national champions Breaking Bad Racing were back with a motley assembly of hoopties. They had their Festiva, they had their Mazda MX-3, they had a Miata, they had a BMW, and a Toyota Tercel that is swapped with a
2ZZ, no shit.
And another multi-car team was Half Fast Racing. Now, before they had two Volkswagen New Beetles and a single salvage title NC Miata, they have added a fourth car, which is a third VW New Beetle. And the team captain, Stan, when he showed up, he looked, what's the word? Exhausted.
Jerry Ringel's Skinny Coyote Racing had 3 Miatas, adding a third one for this, and they took their original one and put a sweet surfboard that leans in the corners on it. Let's just pause to admire this work of art.
Now, if you've been following Lemons closer than the average viewer, you might know that we have not one but 2 X cars from the Celebrity Dodge Daytona series from the 1980s. Now, the Dodge Daytona Celebrity series was 15 Dodge Daytonas that were taken off of the production line, sent to a race shop, and prepared for competition to the tune of $70,000 each in 1988 money. So, weirdly, these 2 cars are among the most depreciated cars that we have racing in Lemons. Now, the 2 cars we have are run by 2 separate teams, and these are the cars that were originally raced by Ricky Schroeder and Don Dokken.
A Dokken fan, man. This car sucked ass in our race, of course. It did some laps, it cooked the brakes, it broke some stuff. The team packed up and went home. But Dokken.
Now, you may be asking yourself, who else raced in the Celebrity Dodge Daytona Challenge series, and how can I get one of those cars to race myself in Lemons? Well, good news. All the rest of them are hoarded by a single guy somewhere down there in the South. So if you want to race the Dodge Daytona that was originally raced by Tommy Lee, Otis Redding Jr., or David Hasselhoff, find that guy in his junkyard. They're all just sitting there waiting to be Lemons cars.
As usual, we saw many good themes. A Feudal and Stupid Gesture had their Mazda Miata. This time they traded their dinosaur costumes for this. They otherwise had a fairly eventful weekend, putting the car into the wall and bending all of their suspension, but they straightened everything out and got back on the track. Good job, guys.
You may remember the Event Horizon Plymouth Horizon from the Lemons World episode. Well, they crashed that Plymouth Horizon on the test day, but they yanked it back out and went racing. Then you had the Team Beam Dream Team and their Subaru WRX. This is a Subaru with a swapped-in Toyota Beams motor. That ought to dominate, but instead they crashed and the car sort of fell apart. More importantly, they brought a theme dedicated to the 2 notable businesses right next to Barber Motorsports Park, Buc-ee's and Bass Pro Shops.
Man made quite a splash at a Bass Pro Shop when he swam naked in a giant aquarium.
If you're going to show up with a boring Miata, you may as well dress like chickens, like the team Freebird.
Escape Velocity Racing dragged out their Triumph TR8, and they had a Barbie theme with one of our favorite Lemons racer couples, Jen and Rob Simpson. Although for the theme, Rob was Barbie and Jen was Ken, and they also had Lemons legend Anton Lovett, and he was a pony. But whatever. They raised money at the potluck for Lemons of Love by selling shots of special edition Malort, and then that money was presented to Lemons of Love by Hangover Barbie.
Speaking of Malort, our late friend Johan Samantha was one of the greatest proponents of Malort we've ever met. His friends and his family raced his Beetle for the first time at this race, and everybody was hanging around reminiscing. We tried to give them the green flag, but the track may have been oiled down and there was some confusion, and Lemons people don't know how to handle a green flag with a double yellow, so sorry about that to everyone.
Apocalyptic Racing brought back their Ford Mustang that we saw last with a swapped-in Flathead 6 from an airport tug. Well, that engine blew up and they were going to put a V8 back in it, but then they decided, who wants a V8 in a Mustang anyway? So team captain Brett got his hands on a Ford 200 straight six and 3-speed manual from a 66 Mustang, put that in place of the Flathead airport tug motor. They had to fabricate their own clutch linkage, and the good news is all of this old technology responds really well to what we call percussive maintenance.
Now we have to mention Dodgers and their Mitsubishi Eclipse. Did you know that Mitsubishi sold Eclipses with the base engine out of a Dodge Nia? Well, these guys had one of those and blew it up 2 years ago. They came back the following year with the best documented rebuild I have ever seen, where they bought an entire PT Cruiser but only used the bottom end of the 2.4 to make to the 2-liter like so. Except that doesn't actually work. It's not supposed to work, so the team captain Alan told us that there was basically a 1,000 RPM gap where it made no horsepower. This year they asked for a residual value to address this and spent that money on this sweet red MSD coil that was totally gonna fix it. And did it fix it?
Yes. Well, not exactly.
There were 3 C4 Corvettes at this race, and this would normally be the time where we play that old game show, which Corvette sucked the least, but God, they all sucked.
Your class winners, Landshark won overall. After 5 second-place finishes, Napoleon Complex finally won Class B. And your Class C winners were Cheap Thrills, who have won it before, but we must point out that 2-time defending Lemons Drivers champion Neil Losi memorized and performed the entire iconic Glengarry-Glen Ross scene to pitch Cheap Thrills Cadillac into Class C.
And you? Your name's Rude?
Yep.
You call yourself a judge, you son of a bitch? I seen better judges at a county fair pie eating contest.
Winded Warriors Racing. It's a 2-car team with a Dodge Dakota and a Ford Mustang. We've talked about them before on this channel because they're awesome, but they've been absent for Lemons Racing for about a year. Well, it turns out after last year's race at Barber, where the hilariously overbuilt AMC 4-cylinder in their Dakota, it was too strong for the transmission and that blew up. After that, team captain Chris Sweeney had a heart attack and spent the entire year rehabbing himself so he could race again with his awesome wife, Rose.
Once he got himself healthy again, Chris picked up right where he left off and added a second car, this Mustang. Now, this was amazing for so many reasons, not least of which is that Chris and Rose don't have a shop or even a covered area to work on the car, and to boot, they prep the cars entirely with hand tools. With hand tools! That's amazing. The cars struggled a bit at this race, but Chris and Rose looked so happy just to be back and surrounded by their friends and teammates. They also had a Beat the Vannenball and/or Dakota fundraiser for Lemons of Love, where they raised almost $1,000. Yeah, most people did beat them, but they paid out the money anyway. That was hella sweet.
But probably the best part of the whole weekend for this team, and really for everybody, was when Rose and Chris finished the race side by side with Chris in the Dakota and Rose in the Mustang. It was amazing.
The eBay Motors Heroic Fix went to Popcorn's Revenge and their Chevy S10. They were registered for the New Hampshire race last year, and when they went to start the engine after installing it just a couple days before the event, the heads were cracked and leaking and they couldn't make the race. So they signed up for the next one. I should clarify, not the next race in their region, just the next race in Alabama, where they do not live. Nor do they live in New Hampshire. They live in Maine. So why would Holly and Matt Gain, who are the team co-captains, want to come all the way down to Alabama to race? Well, on a previous Lemons rally, they met their friend Dylan, who lives in North Carolina, and they wanted to race with him, so they decided to just throw the S10 on the trailer behind their school bus and drive 1,000 miles down to race with their buddy. And that's pretty awesome, but it's not really a heroic fix, is it?
It is not, but let's talk about the engine in their S10. It's a 307 small block, arguably the worst one ever made, but importantly, it came out of a GMC truck that Matt's grandfather bought new. Now, he bought it new because it was super cheap, because the dealership couldn't sell it with the 307 in it. Now, in Matt's grandfather's final days, one of the memories that he kept referencing was driving around in that 307 powered truck with his grandson Matt. So after he passed, Matt and his father were cleaning up, and they set aside that 307 because it was important to the family. Fast forward 17 years, and there's a certain racing series that applauds putting a terrible engine in a different car, and from there the story just writes itself. The 307, along with the T10 4-speed manual, were swapped into the Chevy S10 Extreme. They towed it 1,000 miles and went racing with their buddies. Add all of that up, and you've got Heroic Fix.
I Got Screwed went to Für die Kinder and their BMW 3 Series that's like 10 years old. We saw this car at Road Atlanta. They got a ton of penalty laps, but they had run almost without issue. This time, not so much. These guys are BMW techs at a BMW dealership, and I suppose here's the thing about being a BMW tech. You probably have BMW street cars because you know how to work on them. And maybe, just maybe, a team member's wife drives the exact same car with the exact same engine to the track. And you can see where this goes. Saturday night, they yanked the motor out of the aforementioned street car, and the wife in question was right in the middle with gloves on, helping with the engine swap, turning her street car into a paperweight that they then had to tow home. She might be driving the caged race car to and from the office now. We're not really sure, but her daily driver isn't driving daily at the moment. They got screwed.
We had a special award at this race, and it went to 6 million forms of domination in their Mercedes E320 wagon. They found this car listed for $1,500. It was owned by a college student who got rear-ended and didn't understand that the title was now salvage, and that made it worth less. They offered $500. It was accepted. Then they stripped and sold the mint condition interior, put in the cage, and raced it. They didn't even replace the broken plastic bits on the back, which they could have replicated with a 3D printer.
They drove the Mercedes to the track, raced it all Saturday, rotated the tires Saturday night, drove it all Sunday, and then drove it home. All while looking like it had gotten lost somewhere between the... I don't know, what's a private school near Birmingham? You know? Yeah, that, and the Mountain Brook Aquatic Club. So we called it the Sidetracked While Dropping Off Trip in Kaylee at Swim Practice Award.
Judge's choice went to Bunny Motorworks and their Volkswagen Rabbit Diesel. Now this Rabbit Diesel is the later high-output version of the non-turbo diesel Rabbit, so instead of 48 horsepower, the sticker right there on the sheet metal will tell you that this car makes 52 horsepower.
No shit.
All joking aside, these little Mark I Golfs are kind of perfect lemon starter cars. They don't weigh anything, they don't use up their suspension or brakes or tires, and they probably get 30 miles to the gallon while being driven at wide open throttle constantly for 14 hours. So, 15 gallons of diesel ought to cover your weekend.
Nick is exaggerating, maybe just a little bit, but they did have a pretty decent Monty Python and the Holy Grail theme with the Killer Rabbit. You know what? Just love seeing a Rabbit Diesel with the stock engine in it. Ran most of the weekend with the occasional troubleshooting and then broke down like 80 feet short of the checkered flag.
I was so close!
Get yourself a diesel Volkswagen. You won't regret it.
Organizer's choice went to You Don't Know Ditka and their honest-to-goodness factory Jaguar XJR. This thing's got like 300 horsepower, which, for the record, is more than any of the cars that finished like at the top of this field. So how did this car wind up in Class C? Well, it's a 90s Jaguar XJR. It's a loophole.
Now, like most cars of this nature, you don't really need a theme, but this team brought one anyway. Their XJR, which, by the way, is a supercharged Jaguar, has lived most of its life in Chicago before it showed up in Georgia, where they found it for $500. Now, there are all kinds of Chicago sports themes you could do: Harry Carey, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Michael Jordan, Stan Mikita, but they chose Ditka.
The Bears.
The Bears.
That's a pretty solid choice, I gotta say, as a lifelong Chicago area resident, but I gotta ask, where's the Super Bowl Shuffle?
I'm the punky QB known as McMahon. When I hit the turf, I've got no plan.
The Halloween Meets Gasoline Award, $1,000 for the best theme, decorations, costumes, went to Vannenball in the Dodge Caravan. Now, as we mentioned in the 2023 season wrap-up video, for 2024, Zach's Dodge Caravan is going to race every single event on the schedule. And that plan got off to an auspicious start.
When we rolled into the paddock, we saw them frantically painting their whole van black. And we didn't really know what was going on until we saw them later, and we realized that the fuzz was onto them. It's a whole gag from the film Cannonball Run. They were in full Cannonball costumes. It was Vannenball does Cannonball. Kinda on the nose, but really well done. Sure, the van didn't have things like working brake pads or non-failed ball joints, but they got it all fixed. We're sure that's just an aberration for the rest of the year, and it ran most of the weekend and was kind of awesome in the rain, actually.
Yeah, they were missing some details, but what they did have was an absolutely bitchin' potluck in the paddock, and they raised a bunch of money for Lemons of Love, and I guess we're gonna see him again in a couple of weeks at Thunderhill.
That brings us at last to the Index of Effluency by Blind Squirrels Racing, which was the first race for Team Captain Steven with his own car. He's been in a Arrive and Drive before, but this car in particular has been earmarked for Lemons for a decade. On the back of the hatch was lettered Future Race Car. Steven finally got his hands on it. It's tough to document 10 entire years, so we'll just skip all the reasons why it didn't become a Lemons car and focus on the fact that Steven got his hands on it and finally made it into a Lemons car, even bringing it into the paddock after the first couple laps to scrape Future off the window.
Now, this is a completely stock Skort with the base model 88 horsepower 4-cylinder, 3-speed automatic, and it kicked the shit out of BMWs, Miatas, Civics, and more. This is all despite having to take some time off during the race for bodywork from getting run into. Maybe before the next event they can 3D print some new bumpers. In the end, they beat almost 80 teams with one of the 10 slowest cars of the entire weekend. That's how you win Index of Effluency.
And here's Lemons in a nutshell.
Every second you don't subscribe or watch one of these videos, another Vega is sent to the crusher. Won't you help us save Classic?